The sun was just beginning to rise over the sleepy town of Willow Creek, casting a golden hue over the quiet streets and the serene lake that bordered the small community. The town was picturesque, with its neatly trimmed lawns, white picket fences, and rows of identical houses that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. But beneath the surface of this idyllic town, a storm was brewing. Ethan Harper sat on the edge of his dock, his feet dangling over the water as he sipped his morning coffee. The dock had been his sanctuary for as long as he could remember, a place where he could escape the chaos of the world and just be. It was a simple structure, built by his father years ago. But to Ethan, it was more than just a dock. It was a connection to his past, a reminder of the man who had taught him how to fish, how to be patient, and how to appreciate the stillness of the water. But that morning, the stillness was shattered by the sound of an engine roaring in the distance. Ethan's heart skipped a beat as he turned his head toward the noise. His gut told him something was wrong before his eyes even focused on the source of the sound. He stood up, his coffee forgotten, as a massive yellow bulldozer came into view, its steel blade glinting in the morning sun. The machine was grinding over the shore, tearing through the delicate ecosystem like a knife through butter. Ethan's dock, his sanctuary, was in its path. He didn't even stop to put on proper shoes. He sprinted out the front door, still in his pajama pants, his breath coming in sharp bursts as he charged toward the destruction. The workers operating the bulldozer didn't even flinch as Ethan approached. They acted like he wasn't even there, like he was invisible. He stumbled over broken planks, his bare feet scraping against jagged edges, but he barely felt the pain. All he could see was the destruction of something that had been in his family for decades. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan's voice cracked with rage as he skidded to a halt in front of the machine. The operator, a middle-aged man in an orange vest, didn't even turn his head. He just kept pushing forward, following orders. Ethan's fists clenched as he scanned the area. That's when he saw her, Victoria Langston, standing a few feet away with her arms crossed, her manicured nails gleaming in the morning sun. Her expression was the perfect blend of amusement and indifference, like she was watching a minor inconvenience rather than the destruction of something that had been in Ethan's family for decades. "Victoria." Ethan stormed toward her, pointing at the wreckage. "You better have a damn good explanation for this." She smiled, not the friendly kind, but the kind that made Ethan's blood pressure skyrocket. "This dock was in violation of HOA Code 37B, she said, tilting her head in mock sympathy. "We sent you multiple warnings." Ethan let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his disheveled hair. "You mean those notes you shoved under my door last night? Real generous of you to give me a full 12 hours before bringing in the wrecking crew." Victoria shrugged. "Rules are rules, Mr. Harper." A loud snap echoed behind him, and Ethan turned just in time to see his father's old fishing chair get crushed beneath the bulldozer's treads. The wood crumbled like dust, and something inside Ethan cracked. His father had built that chair with his own hands, spending hours on that dock teaching Ethan how to fish, how to be patient, how to appreciate the stillness of the water. And now, all of it, every memory, every connection to his dad, was being wiped out in front of his eyes. A wave of fury rolled through him. "This isn't about a stupid HOA rule, is it?" Victoria's smile widened. "You're a difficult resident, Ethan. You don't attend our meetings, you ignore our landscaping guidelines, and quite frankly, you don't belong in this community." There it was, the real reason. She didn't like that Ethan refused to bow to her ridiculous rules, that he didn't fall in line like the rest of the neighborhood. Ethan took a slow breath, forcing himself to stay calm, to not give her the satisfaction of seeing him snap. "You're going to regret this," he said, his voice dangerously even. Victoria raised a perfectly sculpted eyebrow. "Oh, and what exactly are you going to do?" Ethan smiled, but there was nothing friendly about it. "You'll see." She laughed, actually laughed, as if he were some joke. "Good luck with that. Your dock is gone, Ethan. You're not getting it back." He didn't say another word. He turned and walked away, fists clenched so tightly his knuckles went white. He could feel the stares of the other HOA board members, their smug little grins, their whispers. They thought they'd won. They thought he was just some average guy who would take the hit and disappear. They had no idea who they were messing with. Ethan Harper wasn't just some guy. He was the governor's brother, and he was about to make their lives a living hell. Ethan stormed back into his house, slamming the door behind him. His mind was already racing through the possibilities. He could call his brother, sure. Governor William Harper had enough pull to wipe out this HOA with a single phone call. But that would be too easy, too clean. No, Ethan wanted something better. He wanted to watch Victoria squirm, to see the smugness drain from her face when she realized she had messed with the wrong person. He grabbed his laptop and started digging. If there was one thing he knew about HOA presidents like Victoria, it was that they thrived on power and control. And where there was power, there was corruption. It didn't take long to find the first red flag. The HOA's financial records were a mess. Misfiled invoices, misplaced fines, unexplained transactions that conveniently benefited Victoria and her closest allies. He found receipts for extravagant vacations, spa trips, and designer handbags, all under the guise of community maintenance. Bingo! Ethan leaned back in his chair, a slow grin spreading across his face. This was just the beginning, but he needed more proof, more people who had been wronged by the HOA's ridiculous fines and restrictions. As if on cue, his phone buzzed. It was his neighbor, Old Man Thompson, the guy who had been fined $1,000 for having a mailbox that was the wrong shade of beige. "I saw what they did to your dock, kid," the old man said, his voice gruff. "I think it's time we fight back." Ethan exhaled, a surge of determination flooding through him. Damn right it is. The war had just begun. Ethan sat at his kitchen table, his fingers flying over the keyboard as he pulled up every HOA record he could get his hands on. The coffee in his mug had gone cold hours ago, but he barely noticed. The rage from earlier had settled into something sharper, something colder. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was focused. The kind of focus that had won him fights in the past, the kind that made people nervous when they saw it in his eyes. The HOA wasn't just some petty neighborhood committee with a superiority complex. No, this was something deeper, something rotten. The more he dug, the worse it got. At first, it was little things: overcharged HOA fees, unexplained expenses, payments listed under vague terms like community improvement that had no documentation to back them up. Then he found the real gold mine. Victoria Langston had been running the HOA like her personal piggy bank for years. Thousands of dollars funneled into accounts that didn't belong to the association, invoices from fake vendors, even checks made out directly to her under the guise of administrative bonuses. Ethan let out a low whistle as he leaned back in his chair. This wasn't just corruption, this was fraud. He glanced at the clock. It was past midnight, but he knew he wouldn't be sleeping anytime soon. Instead, he grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the one person who could help him blow this whole thing wide open. Sarah Mitchell, investigative journalist and professional thorn in the side of every corrupt official she had ever crossed paths with. They had gone to college together, and while Ethan had chosen a quieter life, Sarah had made a career out of exposing people like Victoria. He hit the call button. It rang twice before she picked up. "Ethan Harper," she said, her voice groggy but instantly intrigued. "Why do I have a feeling this isn't a social call?" Ethan grinned. "Because you know me too well." "Uh-huh. And what exactly have you gotten yourself into this time?" He hesitated for half a second, then said, "How do you feel about taking down a corrupt HOA president?" There was a pause. Then, "Tell me everything." Ethan laid it out for her. The fines, the bulldozing, the fraudulent financial records, every detail, every piece of evidence he had gathered so far. He could hear her shifting in bed, probably grabbing a notepad. "This is good," she said when he finished. "Really good. But we need more." "I know," Ethan said. "And I have a feeling I know exactly where to get it." The next morning, Ethan found himself standing outside Old Man Thompson's house, hands shoved into his pockets as he waited for the door to open. It swung wide, and the old man squinted at him before stepping aside. "Took you long enough," Thompson muttered, motioning for Ethan to follow him inside. The living room looked exactly like Ethan remembered it: wood-paneled walls, a recliner that had seen better days, and a TV that was permanently tuned to the news. But what caught his attention was the stack of papers on the coffee table. Thompson sat down with a grunt and motioned to them. "Everything you're looking for is in there," he said. "I've been keeping track for years." Thought about going public once, but figured no one would listen to some grumpy old man. Ethan flipped through the papers, his jaw tightening with every page. This was it. There were signed statements from homeowners who had been fined for nonsense violations, kids leaving bikes in driveways, porch decorations that didn't fit the HOA's strict guidelines. Even one woman who had been forced to repaint her front door 3 times because Victoria claimed the shade of blue wasn't community appropriate. Then there were the bigger things, complaints about Victoria using HOA funds to pay for personal expenses, documents that proved she had been overcharging homeowners for maintenance that had never actually been done, emails from board members who had tried to challenge her only to be mysteriously voted out before they could push for an audit. Ethan let out a low breath. This wasn't just fraud, it was an entire system of abuse. He looked up at Thompson. Why didn't you do anything with this before? The old man gave him a tired smile. Because she had the board in her pocket, and anyone who fought back got buried in fines until they either paid up or left. Ethan nodded slowly. He had no doubt Victoria would have done the same to him if she had known who he really was. But she had underestimated him, and that was going to be her biggest mistake. He grabbed his phone and called Sarah. "I've got what you need," he said the moment she answered. There was a brief silence. Then, "Meet me in an hour." An hour later, they were sitting in a diner, a thick folder spread out between them. Sarah flipped through the pages, her eyes narrowing. "This is bad," she murmured. "Like prison time bad." Ethan smirked. "That's the idea." She looked up at him. "We can go public with this, but we need a final nail in the coffin. Something undeniable, something that will force the board to turn on her." Ethan thought for a moment. Then slowly, he smiled. "I think I know exactly how to get it." That night, he attended his first HOA meeting in years. Victoria was already there, standing at the front of the room with her usual smug expression, flanked by board members who looked more like hostages than willing participants. The room was packed, homeowners, neighbors, people who had all felt the weight of her ridiculous rules. Ethan waited until the meeting was in full swing before he stood up. "I have a question," he said, his voice carrying over the murmurs. Victoria's smile faltered just slightly. "This isn't the time for questions, Mr. Harper." Ethan shrugged. "I just wanted to know if you could explain these." He stepped forward and placed the folder on the table in front of her. The room fell silent. Victoria hesitated, then flipped open the top page. Her face paled. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice just enough that only she could hear. "I wonder what would happen if the governor saw these." Victoria's hands clenched into fists. For the first time, she looked rattled. Ethan smiled. "Checkmate." Victoria's fingers twitched as she flipped through the stack of papers, her face frozen in that artificial smile she always wore when she wanted to intimidate someone. But this time, it wasn't working. The room had gone completely silent, all eyes locked on her as she stared down at undeniable proof of her corruption. Ethan could practically hear her mind scrambling for a way out, a way to twist this in her favor. She wasn't the type to admit defeat, she was the type to double down. She lifted her head, clearing her throat before speaking. "These are blatant forgeries," she said, her voice just a little too controlled. "You think a couple of doctor documents will scare me? This is nothing but a desperate attempt to smear my reputation." Ethan smirked, watching the cracks in her composure spread. "Oh, I figured you'd say that," he said casually, pulling out his phone. "Which is why I made sure to get something a little more undeniable." He tapped the screen and hit play. The sound of Victoria's own voice filled the room, cold and condescending. "I don't care if they can't afford the fines. If they want to live here, they'll pay. And if they can't, they can leave. More properties for us to resell at a premium." Victoria's face turned a shade paler. The recording continued, detailing how she manipulated HOA fees, funneled money into her personal accounts, and pressured board members into silence. The murmurs in the room grew louder, shifting from confusion to outright anger. People who had once been too afraid to speak up were now whispering to each other, realizing just how deep this corruption ran. A man near the back stood up, his voice trembling with fury. "So that's why my fines kept doubling. You were just trying to force me out." Another woman shot to her feet. "You made me repaint my house twice because you didn't like the color. You made me spend thousands of dollars just because you could." More voices joined in, the tension rising like a storm about to break. Victoria slammed her hands on the table. "This meeting is over," she snapped, her voice tight with panic. "Everyone, go home." No one moved. Ethan crossed his arms. "Looks like no one's listening to you anymore, Victoria." She shot him a glare sharp enough to cut steel. "I will have you thrown out of this community, Harper." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, I don't think you will. In fact, I think you're the one who's about to be thrown out." Victoria turned to the board members, her last hope at regaining control, but the men and women who once backed her unconditionally now looked hesitant, even afraid. One of them, a man named Richard, cleared his throat. "Victoria, this is serious. We need to discuss this." Victoria's expression twisted with disbelief. "You're taking his side? After everything I've done for this community?" Richard shifted uncomfortably. "We can't ignore this. If these accusations are true, we're all at risk." Victoria scoffed. "Accusations? This is nothing but a smear campaign. I built this community. I made it what it is today." Ethan leaned against the table, amused by how quickly her arrogance was crumbling. "No, Victoria. You built a kingdom for yourself while everyone else suffered. And now that kingdom is burning." Victoria's breath was coming in short, sharp bursts. She had always been untouchable, always been the one holding the power. But now, the power was slipping from her fingers, and she had no idea how to stop it. Then, in a last desperate attempt, she straightened her back and turned to Ethan with a chilling smile. "You think you've won? You have no idea what I'm capable of." Ethan didn't flinch. "Neither do you." For the first time, real fear flickered in her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned on her heel and stormed out of the meeting hall. Ethan watched her go, knowing full well that she wasn't done fighting. Victoria wasn't the type to go down without a war. And if she couldn't hold on to her power the legal way, she'd try something much worse. That night, Ethan barely made it into his house before his phone buzzed. It was Sarah. "You need to be careful," she said, skipping right past pleasantries. "Victoria is already trying to spin this. I have sources telling me she's reaching out to people, trying to push the blame onto the board. She's calling you a liar, saying you doctored the audio." Ethan wasn't surprised. "Let her try? The evidence is solid. She's desperate, Ethan. And desperate people do stupid things." He exhaled, pinching the bridge of his nose. He knew Sarah was right. Victoria wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. She would fight until her last breath, and if he wasn't careful, she'd find a way to turn the tables. The next morning, his suspicions were confirmed. Ethan walked outside to find a tow truck parked in his driveway, its driver attaching a chain to his truck. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Ethan barked, marching toward the man. The driver barely looked at him. "Got an order from the HOA. Non-compliance violation." Ethan clenched his jaw. Non-compliance of what? The driver handed him a notice. It was a list of fabricated violations: unregistered vehicle, improper parking, failure to maintain property appearance. Ethan's grip tightened around the paper. This was Victoria's doing, her last-ditch effort to make his life miserable. The driver gave him an apologetic shrug. "Look, man, I don't want any trouble. I'm just following orders." Ethan took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. Then he pulled out his phone and dialed a number. It rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Governor Harper speaking." Ethan smirked. "Hey, bro. How do you feel about taking down an HOA?" There was a pause, then, "What did they do?" Ethan chuckled, watching as the tow truck driver's expression shifted from bored indifference to outright panic. "Oh, just some small-town corruption. But don't worry, I've got it handled." The driver hurriedly unhooked the truck without another word and drove off. Ethan watched him go, shaking his head. Victoria was playing checkers while he was playing chess. She wanted a war. She was about to lose one. Ethan knew Victoria wouldn't go down without a fight, but he had underestimated just how petty she could be. The next morning, he woke up to find a bright red notice taped to his front door. He yanked it off and scanned the text, already knowing it was another one of her desperate moves. Apparently, he had been fined $10,000 for violating community landscaping regulations. His crime? Letting his grass grow half an inch too tall. He laughed, a deep, incredulous laugh. She really thought this was going to break him? She thought he'd roll over because of a ridiculous fine? She was grasping at straws, and that meant she was scared. Good. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He glanced at the screen. Sarah, you're on the news, she said the moment he answered. Ethan blinked. Excuse me. Victoria went to the press, Sarah said, her tone laced with frustration. She's claiming that you're harassing her, spreading lies, and trying to incite violence against the HOA. She's playing the victim card hard. Ethan ran a hand down his face. You've got to be kidding me. Not even a little. She held a press conference. She was practically crying. It was some Oscar-worthy acting. Ethan sighed. You should have expected this. Victoria wasn't just a dictator. She was a manipulator. She knew how to twist the narrative to make herself look like the innocent party. He had seen it before. People like her never took accountability. They just played the victim until everyone else got tired of fighting. Too bad for her. Ethan wasn't the kind to get tired. He grabbed his keys and headed out the door. If Victoria wanted a battle in the public eye, he was more than happy to oblige. By the time Ethan arrived at the community center, it was packed. The HOA meeting was supposed to be a routine check-in, but thanks to the recent chaos, half the neighborhood had shown up. There were news cameras, reporters, and homeowners whispering amongst themselves. Some people looked angry, others looked worried. Victoria was standing at the front of the room, dressed in her usual power suit, smiling like she hadn't just tried to destroy Ethan's life. Ethan took his seat near the back, arms crossed as he watched her work the crowd. I know things have been tense lately, she said, her voice dripping with fake sympathy. There have been accusations, misinformation, and frankly, a lot of unnecessary hostility. A few people nodded. She was good. Ethan had to give her that. But I want to assure you, Victoria continued, placing a hand over her heart. Everything I've done has been for the betterment of this community. I have always had your best interests at heart. Ethan almost choked on his own laughter. A man in the front row stood up. Then what about the fines? My wife and I were charged $3,000 for having a bird feeder. Victoria sighed, shaking her head like a disappointed mother. We have to maintain standards. The HOA rules exist to protect property values. Another voice chimed in. What about the time you made the Jeffersons repaint their house 3 times because you didn't like the shade of blue? That was a misunderstanding, Victoria said quickly. Ethan watched, amused, as the crowd slowly started to turn against her. Then he stood up. Victoria, he said, his voice calm but carrying. How much of the HOA funds have you spent on your personal expenses? The room went silent. Victoria's smile faltered. Excuse me. Ethan pulled out his phone. Would you like me to list them? The spa treatments? The first-class flights? The personal chef you paid for with HOA money? Victoria's face went pale. That's a baseless accusation. Oh, is it? Ethan tapped his phone. Because I have receipts. I have emails. I have bank statements. And if you'd like, I can forward them all to every single person in this room right now. A murmur ran through the crowd. Victoria clenched her jaw. This meeting is over, she snapped, turning to leave. But before she could take a step, another board member stood up. Richard, the same man who had hesitated at the last meeting. No, he said, his voice shaking but firm. It's not over. Victoria turned slowly, eyes narrowed. What did you say? Richard swallowed hard. I said it's not over. We need to address this. The murmur grew louder. More board members were nodding. More homeowners were whispering. The tide was shifting. Ethan took a step forward. The truth is out, Victoria. You've been robbing these people for years. You used the HOA to fund your own lifestyle while making everyone else miserable. Victoria's hands clenched into fists. I will sue you for slander. Ethan smirked. Please do. I'd love to see this go to court. That was the final nail in the coffin. Victoria's eyes darted around the room, but she could see it as clearly as Ethan could. She had lost. The community wasn't on her side anymore. The board wasn't on her side. And now, the cameras were rolling, capturing every second of her downfall. She turned on her heel and stormed out, shoving past reporters who bombarded her with questions. Ethan let out a slow breath. It was over. Or so he thought. Later that night, as Ethan sat on his newly rebuilt dock, his phone buzzed again. It was Sarah. You need to see this, she said. She sent him a link. Ethan clicked it. It was a news article. HOA president under investigation for fraud. His lips curled into a grin. He had won. But as he leaned back in his chair, watching the stars reflect off the water, He had a feeling Victoria wasn't done yet. People like her never knew when to quit. Ethan woke up the next morning to the sound of his phone vibrating against his nightstand. He groggily reached for it, squinting at the screen. It was Sarah. He knew she wouldn't be calling this early unless it was important. He sat up, running a hand through his hair before answering. "You're famous," Sarah said before he could even get a word in. Ethan rubbed his eyes. "What now?" Victoria's meltdown at the HOA meeting went viral. News stations are picking it up, and it's spreading like wildfire. Ethan let out a slow breath. He had expected backlash, expected attention, but he hadn't expected it to happen this fast. "She hasn't been arrested yet, has she?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Not yet," Sarah said. "But it's only a matter of time." The state's attorney general announced they're launching a full investigation. "Apparently, she's been under suspicion for a while, but your little exposé just fast-tracked things." Ethan swung his legs over the side of the bed. He wasn't going to celebrate just yet. Victoria had too many connections, too many people in her pocket. She was the kind of person who thrived on control, and when people like that started to lose, they got desperate. As if on cue, there was a loud knock at his front door. Ethan glanced toward it, his instincts kicking in. Something didn't feel right. He set his phone down without hanging up and grabbed the baseball bat he kept by his nightstand, just in case. He opened the door. Standing there was a man in a suit, his expression unreadable. Behind him, parked at the curb, was a black sedan with tinted windows. Ethan didn't recognize him, but he had a pretty good idea of who sent him. "Ethan Harper?" the man asked, his voice smooth and professional. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. "Depends on who's asking." The man didn't smile. "I represent some concerned parties who believe you might be making a mistake." Ethan arched an eyebrow. "Is that so?" The man nodded. "You've caused quite a stir, Mr. Harper. Some people feel that it would be in everyone's best interest if this all just went away." Ethan exhaled slowly. "You mean Victoria?" The man didn't confirm or deny it, which was confirmation enough. Ethan smirked. "And what exactly is she offering? A bribe? A threat? Let me guess. I back off, and she pretends none of this ever happened?" The man straightened his tie. "Something like that. You'd be surprised how quickly these kinds of problems disappear when the right arrangements are made." Ethan chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's the problem. Victoria spent her whole life making things disappear. Not this time." The man studied him for a moment before sighing. "I was hoping you'd be reasonable." Ethan tightened his grip on the bat. "And I was hoping you'd take a hint and get off my porch." The man's jaw tensed, but he nodded. "Have it your way." Without another word, he turned and walked back to his car. Ethan watched as the sedan pulled away, disappearing down the street. He had dealt with people like this before. People who thought power made them untouchable. They always underestimated the wrong person. He picked his phone back up. Sarah was still on the line. "Well," she said, "that sounded interesting." Ethan let out a breath. "Victoria's scared." Sarah hummed in agreement. "Good." That afternoon, the news broke. The FBI had raided the HOA office. Victoria had been taken in for questioning. The evidence Ethan had provided was just the tip of the iceberg. Investigators had uncovered years of financial fraud, embezzlement, and even tax evasion. The headlines were brutal. HOA president arrested in major fraud scandal. Victoria Langston taken into custody, faces multiple felony charges. Ethan sat back, watching the coverage unfold on his TV. Cameras flashed as Victoria was led out of the building in handcuffs, her face pale, her usual confidence completely gone. She tried to cover her face, but there was no escaping this. The reporters swarmed, shouting questions. "Victoria, do you have anything to say? Were you aware of the full extent of the fraud? Do you regret targeting residents with unfair fines?" Victoria didn't answer. She just kept walking, her heels clicking against the pavement as she was loaded into the back of a squad car. Ethan shook his head. It was over. He could hear cheering outside. His neighbors, the same people Victoria had spent years controlling, were celebrating. It wasn't just about her going to jail. It was about freedom. They were finally free from her ridiculous rules, her constant harassment, her greed. His phone buzzed again. It was his brother. "You really did a number on this one," Governor William Harper said with a chuckle. Ethan smiled. "You know me, always stirring up trouble." "Well, I just got a call from the State Housing Commission. They want me to push new regulations on HOAs, tighter oversight, stricter rules against abuse. Your little war might actually change the system. Ethan blinked. He hadn't even thought about that. He just wanted Victoria gone. But now, his fight had started something bigger. His brother hesitated for a moment. They also want to know if you'd be interested in helping with the reforms. Maybe even leading a committee. Ethan laughed. Absolutely not. Governor Carter chuckled. Figured as much. Just thought I'd ask. Ethan glanced out the window. The sun was setting over the lake, casting golden light over the water. I think I'll stick to fishing, he said. His brother sighed. All right. But if you ever change your mind. I won't, Ethan said. His brother laughed. Enjoy your peace, then. Ethan hung up, setting his phone aside. He grabbed a beer from the fridge and made his way to the dock, the same dock Victoria had destroyed. It had taken some work, but the community had come together to rebuild it better than before. He sat down, letting his feet dangle over the edge. The water was calm, the kind of calm he hadn't felt in weeks. It was finally over. No more ridiculous fines. No more threats. No more HOA tyranny. As he took a sip of his beer, he heard a voice behind him. You know, Sarah said, stepping onto the dock. You could make a career out of this. Ethan shook his head. Not a chance. She smirked. Well, at least tell me you're going to enjoy the victory. Ethan looked out at the water, feeling the weight of the last few weeks finally lift off his shoulders. Oh, I plan to, he said. I plan to enjoy every second of it. And for the first time in a long time, he truly meant it. Thank you for taking the time to listen to today's story on Store of Good Stories. If this story touched your heart or made you think, don't forget to hit like and share the video to spread this positive message to more people. And if this is your first time here, make sure to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you won't miss any of the meaningful stories we share every week. Your support is the biggest motivation for Store of Good Stories to keep bringing heartfelt and valuable stories to you. See you in the next video.